Amina has been having problems with her connection, so I want to make sure she gets on and gets to speak in case anything goes wrong. So Amina, if you're okay to chime in, we'd welcome this opportunity.
Let's see. Okay. Hopefully you can see me and hear me. My name is Amina Ali, and I am a lawyer and development practitioner. And I've been working in the area of policy, advocacy and policy reforms, as well as community empowerment and mobilization, particularly working with girls and young women to build their agency and give them skills sort of to challenge harmful practices within their communities, and sort of be the drive for change within those communities. Now, to tap into the question of why is it important to consider language, I think it's important to first know that language distinguishes our work, but then it's also a reflection of our values, and I think it's something that Lena also touched on. It has power to influence change, and that change can be both positive and negative. So we need to be very careful on the terminologies that we use. In that way, we ensure that the message we're actually taking across is what we actually have envisioned to bring to our communities and our societies in general. Thank you.
Thanks, Amina, and we're glad your line is holding up, so we'll be able to kind of speak to you a little bit more about some of these issues in the question and answer session. So Fyd, if I can bring you into the conversation next.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. Where do I start? I think both Lena and Amina have covered quite a bit, I think, in terms of why language is important. I just want to maybe start off with a quote from Gungi wa Thiong'o, to which he says, "Language carries the entire body of values by which we come to perceive ourselves and our place in the world." So as Amina said, and I think Lena earlier as well, language carries a lot of our beliefs and a lot of our understanding of issues. So it's a huge significant tool or element of who we are. So whether we present language within our own organization, or how we speak, whether it's in person, so to speak, the way you speak or the way you pronounce certain words and the way you say them, they mean a lot, and they mean differently to different communities. I think for me, within our sector, really when it comes to language is looking at where the language of development initially started from, and how far have we moved on from those languages or words or terminologies that we used to use in the 60s and 70s, or even before that. So there's a whole issue of really unpacking and decolonizing language altogether. I mean, terminologies such as the third world, for example, to which I'm really happy. I think people are using less and less of those kind of terms, but some people are still I guess, not aware of the implications of using those terms, or using poverty, or calling people poor, for example, and rating a poverty level. I think at times when people do say that, they don't really understand the meaning. And I think within the sector as well, we've been very complacent over the last many years, where we're not scrutinizing our language so much. And I'm glad that, especially now because of Black Lives Matter, because of what happened to George Floyd, is really raising questions about the sector and how the sector is performing in relation to language, in relation to many issues to do with diversity and inclusions as well. The power relations element and depoliticizing language has been mentioned by Lena, and I think that's really important. I think we have to think about the language we use and how other people perceive, and understanding the terminologies and the words we use, especially when we use jargon words. It's very challenging, not just for people in the development sector in itself, but also the general public to understand exactly what we mean by these terms. And I've been reading quite a few articles, and even my brother, I think the other day I was talking to him, and we talked about, he needs to have developmental outcome. His perception of developmental outcome And the way I was referring to him was completely different to what he understood. He thought more or less kind of, I think he viewed it more as a personal development, and I came across as a community development. And anyway, we got lost in translation there somewhere. So I think the words we use really, really important. But also I think the issue of power and where the power lies when it comes to language also has to be looked at very importantly, because when we use language, in especially English, for example, in countries that don't speak English, a lot is lost in translation, or at times it can mean something completely different. And I think some of our speakers have already touched into it. So we have to be careful of what words we use and what they mean to the local partners or the local organization, the community that we work with. And I just want to highlight maybe or say that one last thing in terms of our conversations about language. I think it's really important that the communities that you work with, the communities that you are delivering your projects, have much of a say to say what language should be used when implementing projects. And this is by meaning that, you know, the word, for example, for inauguration that Claire mentioned earlier, it's got completely similar but different meaning to what the Welsh meaning is. So we need to look at what words we're using and how they mean locally. And I think that conversation is about language and terminology and what terminology to use should mostly be driven by the partners in communities and areas that we work in. Thank you.
Thank you, Fyd. I'm just going to take a break in proceedings because we're going to run some polls across the session. So now we've kind of all just given a bit of context about what we're going to be speaking about. I'm just going to ask Kath, my colleague, to run one of the polls, and then I'm going to move into more of a question and answer session. So if Kath, you're all right to run the poll.
Thank you, Claire. I think everybody should now be able to see on their screen the poll and the questions. We've just got 3 quick questions to kind of gauge how you're feeling at the start of the session. So if you could vote on your answers, that would be great. Thank you.
Quick question. On question 1, do you want us to choose the one that we most agree with?
Sorry, yes, please. You can only choose, it's multiple choice, you can only choose one section, so just choose the answer that you most affiliate with. Thank you. Is everyone able to see the poll and vote? Great. Okay, the answers are coming through now. I'm just going to give it 10 more seconds to give everybody who hasn't had a chance to vote. Claire, would you like me to read out the summary of the results?
Yes, please, Kath, because I can't see them on my screen.
Okay. Just some last little minute ones coming in. I think that's everybody. Okay. So if I share the results, you should be able to see that for question 1 we had, I think, the language used in the sector, and then we have 67% have said that they feel that it is outdated and some of the vocabulary is colonialistic and needs to be updated. We have question 2 is, have you discussed the language we use with your partners? And we have a range of people, but the majority of people have said no, that they haven't. And then with the last question, do you plan to discuss language with your overseas partners? We have, it's almost a 50-50 split, with people either saying yes and they know how to approach it, or they want to, but they're not sure how to approach the topic. Thanks.
Thank you, Kath. So there's some quite interesting pieces of information or feedback there, I guess, and just finishing off from what Fyd said at the end of his introduction there. There's some language you use, like beneficiaries, for example, that is maybe quite it's based on kind of grants and funds and being able to report back to funders. But if you were doing a project in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, would you see yourself as a participant or would you see yourself as a beneficiary? And I think most people would feel like they were either participants or employees or deliverers of a project rather than being a beneficiary of a project, for example. And I'm sure that isn't just the people that deliver it, but it's probably the people that participate in the work we do. So it's just that kind of occasional mismatch that sometimes happens, and sometimes we're forced to use the language of our funders, but should that language be used with our partners? In all likelihood, possibly not. And I'll open myself up as well. I'm quite new to the development. I say new, I don't think I can say that anymore, actually. It's been coming up to 18-19 months, and I have to say that when I first started working in this sector, I found the language really inaccessible. And often things were really taken as read, and it was assumed you knew what everyone was talking about, in the same way that Fyd was saying about the conversation with his brother. So kind of people talking about sustainability for me always just implied environmental sustainability. And then I began to get a bit more familiar with the terms and realised that I was talking at cross purposes with everyone most of the time. So it's been a good learning curve, and I'm sure there's plenty of that kind of thing that will go on for all of us today. So I'm going to open back up to questions and answers to Fyd, Lena and Amina, and I'm just going to ask a few myself of things that have kind of come through from what's been discussed, or questions that have been posed in previous discussions, just to start things rolling. And then after that, I'm going to open up to people who are on the webinar as well. So if you'll bear with me for a couple of minutes, and then I'll open things up a bit more. Amina, Fyd and Lena, I'm gonna sometimes pose a question directly to one of the three of you, but otherwise just feel free to pick it up and chime in if you feel like you've got something particularly relevant that you want to say. So I'm going to start first of all with Lena and just ask, what are the key changes in the language that you are currently seeing?
Specifically in terms of phrases, or just in general?
I guess probably phrases would be interesting to really hear about the things that have been maybe most challenged, but also generally, are we finding people are kind of changing their language and it's being adopted, or is it something that people are pushing back on, I guess?
So in terms of the phrases, things like beneficiaries, so which is really a donor-driven term to use. We don't use that. We also don't use empowering people. Who are we to empower anyone, really? So we've started to use the phrases communities we work with, rather than serve, communities we work with. So it's more of a partnership. The global Britain one is something that we are just not using. Leveling up is another one we are not using. Rather than talking about the global south, we would rather talk about specific countries that we're actually talking about. So just name the country, which seems to be a lot easier. The world's poorest as well, marginalized communities, is something that we would just say rather than say the world's poorest. In terms of generally with this piece of work, it's opened up a lot of conversations, and the reaction that we've had is actually that a lot of our members have been thinking about this, or have been waiting to start talking to people about this, and they recognized it was an issue across the sector. They maybe hadn't moved on it yet, so they welcome the conversations, and then they do link it to how we work with partners, how we work with country offices. The one thing that I will say about this work as well is that the language of decolonizing aid, of racism, all of it, it's incomplete. It will be a continuous journey. And as Fadili had mentioned before, the best way that you can go about it is directly talking to people, talking to the communities and the partners that you work with, because there are different perspectives and they're all valid. So it's just a kind of coming to a compromise and recognizing outside perspectives as opposed to just where we are in the UK. But it will be a continuous journey, I think.
Thanks, Lena. It's that was something that I'd been thinking about as well, in terms of adopting the language in order to kind of build understanding for example, Global Britain being like, well, we can speak to these people because it's language they're using, therefore they understand it? Or do we push back on it and say, actually, that's not appropriate? And maybe there'll be a bit of disconnect between understanding, but at least we'll be moving the conversation in a different direction, potentially. Amina, I'm going to bring you in now, if that's okay, just to reflect on the same question about, are you seeing changes in the language? I'm particularly interested because of your background in kind of gender and girls in particular. I guess there's a whole gendered language as well that's kind of has a crosses over with development at times.
Yes, really. There has been a lot of changes over the past I want to say 10 years, but I'm not going to go that deep. But yeah, with regards to words such as child protection versus child safeguarding, those are also things. It's safeguarding brought in a broader concept, and more accountability to organizations to find proactive measures of protecting the people that we're working with, our participants, but then also looking out for the welfare of our staff, volunteers, and it moves on, bringing the accountability even to our board members and whatnot. So I think that was a good expansion on that word. But then there's also when you say it, it's more like, okay, do no harm. What exactly do you mean? But then when you look at it on a broader perspective, it's that do not ensure that you do not hurt the cause more harm than caused before. So it sort of brings us back to that part of accountability within the sector to ensure that the messages that we're putting across, the information, education materials that we are producing are sort of like depicting a good pictures of the context that we're actually in, rather than dehumanizing the communities that we're working with, just so we can please the the donors and whatnot to get funding, especially in Africa. I know that in the sector there have been organizations using very horrid pictures, for instance, of children, and in certain situations where it sort of like devalues them or removes their dignity. So the concept of do no harm, I think it came at the right time to ensure that organizations are taking proactive measures in protecting the people that we're working in, and even reflecting on the messages that we're putting across. Thank you.
Thanks, Amina. Your line just broke up a tiny bit at the very beginning, but otherwise the connection was good. So that's positive. I'm just going to feed back what I think you might have said at the beginning that we might have missed just a tiny section of. And I think you were talking about the kind of direct accountability that organisations have to have in terms of not doing harm to the people that participate in their project. So depicting things positively and not dehumanising people, and we have to be accountable for that and for doing for not harming people through our language. So I think that just summarized where it went a little bit crackly, but otherwise thank you, Amina. Thank you. I'm going to go to Fyd now, and because Fyd, luckily working in Wales, understands some of the context of the groups that we work with, which is generally really small groups. So we just want to ask you, Fyd, if small and large organisations have failed to address these issues, and sometimes it's even harder for small groups to respond. So we just want to have you talk a little bit about how small volunteer-led organisations can get up to date with language, or kind of make sure that language becomes embedded in the work that they do. And I know there'll always be that kind of disconnect between donor language and the language that they want to be using, and that's possibly even more difficult to overcome in a really small organisation. So Fyd, we'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Claire. No, completely. I think donors tend to unfortunately, also the power lies massively on the donors when it comes to language and how we communicate, I guess, and how we write our reports, etc. It's also, the donors who are trying to say, how many beneficiaries have we reached, how many indirect or direct beneficiaries. But I'm kind of to respond kind of in two parts. I've seen, and that's in response to the first question as well that you asked, Lena and Amina. I've seen some changes, especially with some of the donors where they're not really asking or they're not using the jargon that we have used in the sector for quite a lot. I think we're seeing, especially the big funders, the Comic Relief and National Community Lottery, for example, that's within the Welsh context, and international to some extent as well. And the British Council, actually, I've seen the changes in application forms that they're using. And so there is I guess, a push, a drive to change that language, especially the donors are listening, and I guess they hopefully, many of them will be able to go along with the flow of the movement itself and change the way they want sort of the funded bodies to use that language. But just to answer your question, I think what I initially said was really speaking to the partners in the first place, getting to know. I think it's really important the partners are aware what the English jargons mean in the first place, because as I said earlier, the first language for some people isn't English, and their understanding of a certain terminology or certain jargon might be very different to what you're implying. And also there is a challenge, I guess, to some extent when it comes to decolonizing language, because we're decolonizing a language which is already sort of had a massive influence in the partners and organizations that we work with, which is English. And we've used the same terminologies, whether it's log frames, whether it's empowerment, in an English context. So then to look for words which are probably non-English and locally used words probably is the best way we can go. And if you're able to have that conversation with your partner, what word can we use instead of empowerment, for example, in your own specific language, whether it's Swahili or Urdu or Yoruba? What term do we use, and what does that mean in English then? And I think if we are able to write those words into a report to give to the funders and explain that to the funders, then we're able to change our own culture as an organization, as individuals, but also changing the culture that most of the donors have. So that's kind of one key thing, speaking to partners. Educate. It's really important that you are always up to date with language and terminologies that we're using. As I mentioned earlier, we've used probably the same words for many years now, and slowly these changes are happening. So it's really important as a small organization to make sure that you're up to date, and that means only way to do it is to educate, and you can educate yourself through different blogs that are written, connecting to Bond, connecting to Hubcoming Africa. We within Hubcoming Africa, for example, are developing a glossary of these terms that you should and shouldn't use. So hopefully, and that's a live document which we'll keep on updating. So if you feel like you are unsure about certain words, please do come and reach out to us within Hubcoming Africa, and we'll be able to share this document as well and updating it regularly. Attending events and training. I know within Hubcoming Africa, we have our own specific events, but Bond and other development agencies tend to organize various sessions, various events and training and workshops. So really encouraging for you to tap into them and find out, and really just having that inquisitive mind to know what is the current issues that's been discussed in the sector in relation to language or in relation to anything. And I think that also kind of goes into the culture of the organization, changing that culture of your organizations and how you use language. So we've mentioned a few things today, for example, saying empowerment or capacity building or the global north or the global south. Is making sure that when you're having those conversations, whether it's a trustee meetings or you and your partners are having a meeting, you try and avoid to use those words, and you create that culture to make sure that no one within your team is using it. And that obviously over time will creep into the organization or will become a central pillar of the organization to make sure that people are not using words which they shouldn't be using. Because after all, we're not responsible not just to own the partners we work with, but the community at large, the general public, because within our communication tools, whether it's flyers or posters, we use language, and the language we use, people will translate and understanding it in a different way. So we have to make sure that the word we use in our communication channel is also important, relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Fyd. Because you've just talked a little bit about the glossaries that we've been working on, I'm just going to ask you and Lena a little bit maybe to expand on the processes and how you've gone about developing those language glossaries. And I'm also conscious that we've kind of talked about depoliticizing, so global Britain. We've mentioned kind of beneficiaries as a word that that doesn't really speak to what we're doing. We've mentioned and I've just noticed Kath, my colleague, has just shared the glossary link in the chat box as well, if you want to take a look at it. And we've also talked about not saying global south, but speaking about the countries that we're specifically thinking about. So that's kind of helpful in just framing the kind of language that we are discussing here today. But if you and Lena can continue to drop in examples like that, just to keep us mindful of things that we might not have maybe considered, that would be particularly helpful just whilst you talk about the process of developing the glossary. So I don't know if as you're still on my screen, if you just want to have a quick word and then Lena second.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very much a collaborative effort as well. I think we've seen some stuff that Bond have been doing, and Lena and her team as well. And we've been working internally within Hubcoming Africa to develop this this document. And currently, really, it's mostly what we have discussed within team meetings and identify a few words which really we feel that we don't need to use, whether it's terminology or the language we use, we don't need to use. So really trying to figure out what terms or what languages can people use instead of the existing terms. And I guess other than kind of within our members of staff talking and discussing and brainstorming those words, we've also worked with Bond since Bond started doing this work earlier on as well, to pick up a few words or terminologies that they have put on their glossary as well. So I think there's an element of us and Bond kind of continuing having these conversations and making sure we're both up to date, and therefore the sector is up to date with different terminologies. For me, the key thing I think right now would be really interesting to see if we, within the Welsh context, and especially the organizations that are here, to see if they can share with the partners within the continent or where they're working, and see how they feel about these terminologies. Because currently we feel that, personally, I do feel like the drive is still more so coming from our end. And I feel that the partners within communities and countries we work in probably haven't thought or haven't questioned it so much. And I think there's certain words they might be comfortable with, certain words they're not comfortable with. So it's really important, that element of having conversation with the partners to make sure what is relevant to them, what isn't, and how is it said in different language or local language especially. I think for me that translation to a local language is even more important. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Fyd. If Lena, you want to come in on the process that Bond went through, and then I'm going to bring Amina in to reflect on some of the points about the in-country aspects.
Sure, yeah. So we did some brainstorming, first of all, internally with our comms team and our policy team, just anyone who works in specific areas across funding policy, safeguarding, communications, campaigning. So we pulled them all together to discuss what we perceived as problematic phrases that we use in the sector and the government uses, that other actors across the sector use. And then we pulled together an initial list, which is incorporated into the glossary there, of terms that we thought were just not doing anyone any favors, and we shouldn't be held to using just those phrases. And we also asked ourselves, what is the purpose of using that word? What does that language, that phrase mean? What does it really mean? And is there another way that we can talk about communities that we work with without disenfranchising them, without taking away agency, and without the power dynamics at play as well? But we also thought about our principles, given the government in the UK at the moment and how easily we end up with different types of governments for many, many years. How can we still hold true to our values and be consistent in the language that we use, no matter who is the government of the day? So thinking about that, thinking about not reflecting paternalistic views of the world, supporting equity, diversity and inclusion, being accessible and as clear as possible, so jargon free, and making sure that it's consistent across all of the work that we do. So we started that work, and then we shared it with our members. And we got feedback from some of them who wanted to be involved in the process, just to have another brainstorming session. And then after that, it was shared with our members' partners in different places around the world, in different countries around the world. So it was the country officers that were also engaged with it as well. And it's still, as I said, it's still working and open at the moment, but even opening up the dialogue of having a conversation to discuss the words that we use is a starting point, which I think has been really powerful. And hopefully, you know, the whole point about reflecting back to the government and holding them account, one thing that we've noticed is it's different for every single NGO, it's different for every single organization, because the focus of your organization will be different, because you may or may not be getting funded by government. So when you go to the glossary, you can have a look at what terms fit for your values as an organization. What does it make sense for you to work with, use, and also hopefully talk to your partners as well. It will be different, but it will hopefully be more consistent and more joined up across the sector, which I think is what our aim is.
Thank you, Lena. It's good to hear it's been a kind of participative process, and I guess in reflecting on Hubcoming Africa at the moment, we're still slightly earlier on our journey, and it's really good to have so many people on the call today. And we again, like Bond, work in a slightly different context to Bond, so we're small organizations, do slightly different work. So again, if there's terms out there that people are questioning or thinking about, then please feel free to send them our way, and we can do some observation on it. I'm just going to bring Amina in now, because both Lena and Fyd have spoken about the importance of the conversations being led by the countries and programs that we work with, rather than it being a classic UK, in this context, UK-led conversation again. So Amina, I just wanted you to maybe reflect on how you feel you're able to shape these discussions. Has this been a discussion that's happened, has been going on for a while? And I guess in terms of how we're able to better frame those conversations with our partners and make sure that there's an equal power there in that discussion, and it's not an imposition of language. I guess I'm interested in any or all of those points, really, Amina, whichever one you want to pick up on.
So in terms of reflecting on conversations with partners, I think what Fadili said was really important, bringing the conversation back to the people who are actually going to be working with the communities on the ground. And it sort of helps to contextualize the terms, but then also see how we can break them down to the language that is understood, whether that is Kiswahili, etc., etc. But I also feel that, and maybe this is an advice, that we should have partners, especially those who are in Africa, be part of these discussions. While we are creating these terminologies, they should also be part and parcel of that, in a way to sort of like avoid pre-packaging, giving them pre-packaged information to sort of like decide what they're going to do with it once it's time to disseminate the terminologies back to the communities that we work with. I think it's important if the conversations are more inclusive, and in that end, to ensure that like both partners in the West and in Africa all have the same idea, and find different contexts to sort of like fit the terminologies in it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Amina. I'm conscious that I've still got a list of 100 questions I want to ask, but I'm going to stop asking questions now, and I'm going to open it up to people participating in the call if there's any questions. If you can raise your hand, and I will hopefully be able to bring you into the conversation. And of course, if there aren't many questions coming at the moment, I'm happy to carry on asking questions. And also, of course, there's the breakout rooms for discussion as well shortly. But I'm just having a look to see if any questions are forthcoming. And I can't see any hands. Oh yeah, I can see physical hands, not yellow hands like I was looking for. I'm going to go to Stephen Hewitt first, and then Susie at WCIA after that.
Hi there. I've got a question. Since I work with Ziz, who's also in the call at some Teams for You, and I've been involved with Hubcoming for a couple of years now. And one of the things that kind of has confused me a little bit is some of the jargon. I didn't know what the word diaspora meant until recently, and I've now been confronted with another one called agency. Now, I write scripts for videos or our social media for Teams for You. I wouldn't be working in diaspora and agency into any script anytime soon, I don't think, because I don't think most of the people that are our supporters rather than our donors would understand what on earth I was on about. So agency, does that mean like having a traction with something? What does the word mean, and how would you use it? Would you expect the general public to understand that?
Does anyone on the panel want to address that, or I'm looking to see if anyone takes themselves, or Fid's gone for it first. There we go.
Yeah, happy to jump in, and others as well. I think urgency is that it's that element of just the general public having an understanding, and this is just being it's a concerted effort to understand exactly what the agency or the understanding of what the matters are. So it's a drive by the person or by the community to really get to know something in detail in a way that they're able to understand. I think it's another jargon, similar to diaspora. I think is a diaspora as well as a terminology that we've been using in recently, the last maybe 10, 15 years. And again, it's not something that you have to use in all your work, because it might not apply to the work that you do. But within my community, certainly diaspora has been there, and even people within my community don't understand what the term means. So at times as well, we use these terminologies, but yet we have to break them down even further for people to understand. So urgency, yes, we use in the sector quite a lot, but it's really more about people having a concerted effort to understand something, to understand the issues.
I see. It's so plain speaking then is something. I worked with BBC for 35 years, and one of the things they were big at was a plain speaking guide for their journalists. And this is something that you know, when you're writing scripts for the general public to understand, which is how we're doing when we're trying to appeal and to produce material that our supporters can follow, then plain speaking is something that Ziz and I are kind of trying to do. But we're both very aware of not saying things that aren't appropriate. So maybe later in the day, when we break into breakout groups, we could talk about some of the things that, as you're confronted with a blank sheet of paper and you're trying to write down stuff that you think people understand, then I'd be grateful for some help with that. I'm just really glad to be part of this session, so thank you for having me.
Thanks, Stephen. And I think that's what we want to be able to do, is to build an understanding in the different communities that we work with. So and I think that's the value of some of the terminologies and the glossaries we've been working on, is so that there can be a mutual and shared understanding that can be understood as plain language, as opposed to exactly these terms. Because I've noticed Welsh Government have recently adopted Welsh diaspora now for Welsh people who are living in the United States and Australia and things. So it's one of those words that's kind of creeping and flowing through to lots more people now. So I suppose it's a reflection of a bit of a globalized world that more people are.
But we wouldn't want it to be a sort of elitist term, would we?
No, exactly. And we don't want to be.
Because surely communication isn't about that.
No, it's not. And I can say, having started in the sector not too long ago, it's one of the things I found quite difficult when I first arrived, was being like, oh, everyone knows this word and I don't, so I'm just going to go with it. And Fid, I noticed you popped your hand back up, but I'm not sure if you wanted to come back on.
Yeah, just very quickly, just want to say that even for us, we are learning as we go along, especially when it comes to terminologies and language that we use. So if you do feel within the documents that we shared, we're still very clunky with our wording, and it's still very jargony, please do raise it with us. And yeah, it's a live document. We'll keep on changing it.
Thank you, Vid. Lena, do you want to come in? I've noticed you're off mute.
Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, just reflecting on your last note, we do use a lot of language in this sector, but I don't actually know if you do a degree that you learn all this language. Certainly when people come into bond, it's something onboarded, join bond, it's something that we've been mindful of. So therefore we have a session with everybody who joins as a member of staff in bond to explain what DFID, FCDO, DAC, OECD, all the terms mean, all the acronyms that we use, because it's very easy to forget that not everyone understands it. And again, then we're not being accessible. So we've actively tried to think around that to make it as inclusive as we can in terms of the organization. But that's something that we definitely want to reflect through the language that we're using.
Thanks, Lena. I'm going to go to Susie next because she put a physical hand up. And then I'll go to Paul after that. So I can't see Susie. Oh, there you are, Susie.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, my blue hand wouldn't work, so I had to go with the traditional. This is sort of it's intended as a question, but it doesn't sound like a question, because I guess I'm really, it follows a bit on from the last question. What I'm really interested in is how we take some of these really fantastic conversations that are happening in the international development sector and expand them to the international kind of relationships we have more widely. Because I mean, I certainly listen to the discussions on the radio about COVAX and about the vaccination. If you look in the science sector, people are still using developing countries like all the time, and the language that we're talking, it's not, this conversation isn't necessarily hitting in other parts of internationalism. So I'm really interested in how we translate these conversations so that they do have an impact across the wider international sector. You know, Welsh Government, for example, have started using cultural diplomacy instead of soft power, I think because they've been kind of pushed by those who are having these conversations. So there's the kind of, how do we embed this thinking in the wider international sector, so diplomacy and those areas. But then I think, coming back to the point that was just made, you know, we do need a way of communicating this in a simple way with the public. So even the words that we're talking about for replacing the words we don't want to use anymore are still very jargony: agency, diaspora. And those are actually, to some extent, within any sector you've had jargon, and that's okay. We do need to, I think there's still a lot of thought to be given to how do we, when we're having conversations with the public, how do we do that in a way that does start to shift the language, but doesn't make people think, oh God, this is just too complicated, I don't understand what we're talking about. And I think, you know, one of the challenges there are around words like aid, you know, where aid is something that's a simple word, it's a short word, it's quite well understood. We don't want to use it anymore. But actually, how do we create that shift in a way that brings the public with us? And I'm just really interested in that space of taking this conversation that's happening in international development and bringing it more widely, so that actually the two things influence each other and we get a much wider impact on this shift in kind of language that we want to make.
Thank you, Susie. I'm gonna I went heavily on Fadili and Lena for the last answer. Amina, I don't know if you want to come in with any reflections on Susie's point.
With regards to how do we expand these conversations, I think it goes back to what Fadili said earlier in the beginning, that these conversations need to, we need to ensure that we have these conversations with our partners, be it that they're in the international sector or in the diaspora, but then also have these difficult conversations with our donors. Explain that you know, some words, you know, that there have been changes in some words, and why is it that these changes are quite important in the current time. I think once we start doing that, then we are proactively then ensuring that these now become the norm within the sector, and hence I think it makes it easier even to transition from what we previously used to know to the new terminologies that are in right now. I'm not sure if you heard all of that.
We did. Your line's getting better and better, Amina, as we go along, so that's positive. So yeah. So having those kind of brave conversations, and then not just thinking about having the conversations with our development partner, but also having conversations with other organisations that we work with, maybe that might overlap the sectors, I guess. Paul, yeah, that's thank you.
Yes, and I think, and
oh, you're on mute, Amina.
And I think the other thing would be bringing those conversations to the communities to see what they think about these words. And I think that's something we also mentioned earlier as well. It makes more sense when the person you intend the message to go to clearly understands it and is able to give you a good feedback. That way, when you go back to sort of like to review and reflect, it's easier to incorporate that feedback to ensure that we are, like aligning to like get the appropriate terminologies to use within the sector. I think that's it for now.
Thank you, Amina. I'm gonna Paul, you've put your hand up on the screen to ask a question, so please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. A very interesting discussion so far.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion so far.
My point is about something that was raised very early on.
My point is about something that was raised very early on.
And that is the word development stuff can be problematic.
And that's the word development in itself can be problematic.
Because it implies the movement of progress.
It implies a movement and it implies a progress.
I've noticed that the word solidarity is starting to creep in.
It's like the word solidarity is starting to creep in.
I suppose people are advocating for solidarity.
And as somebody who's advocated the word solidarity rather than development,
I'm very happy to see that.
I'm very happy to see that.
But it doesn't imply we do something different.
But it does imply that we do something different.
And I think that's my question. Are we using solidarity to move development, or solidarity a different type of relationships?
And that's my question. Are we using solidarity to mean what we mean by development, or are we using solidarity to mean relationship?
To mean a different type of
relationship.
Thank you, Paul. And I guess that really kind of sums up some of the challenges. If we're just changing language, are we just fiddling around the edges, when actually we need to be looking to make much broader and wider changes to support. This is part of something much wider, I would hope, and that it isn't simply changing language to reflect the same practice, but almost just repackaging it. But actually the language tells us something different about our values potentially, and how our values are changing towards this work. And I mean, saying that the words international development in themselves are quite loaded. What is development? Why are we insisting on development? What does development even mean? When does it end? Where does it begin? And all of those kind of issues are really, really fundamental, and probably shows exactly how much further we have to go. I'm not going to hold the floor on this one because it's something I've been thinking about when I thought about chairing this this chat. So I'm just going to go to Fideli first to see if there's any points you wanted to reflect back to Paul.
Yeah, maybe back to Paul and also to Susie. Maybe first start with Susie's point as well, to which obviously Amina answered very well. I just want to say that, yeah, I think, and Paul, sorry, I don't know if Paul or Donald also mentioned that we can influence ourselves and people around us, but changing others is much more questionable. And it's absolutely right. I think these are the things that will probably take a long time in order to get everyone on board. And so we have to be aware that, yes, we can change the culture of organization, we can change the culture of people we work with, but I think on a wider scale, there's much more work to be done, and whether it's working with the donors, but also with the general public. And it's a process. And I think most of what you hear today, and probably on the other dialogue days as well, is really, this is a journey, this is a process. We're not expecting everyone to be on board all at once. It will take time, and I think over time people will get to understand and shift their mindset or shift their culture on how they view and use these different terminologies. And so there's different prongs, different approaches, I guess, to make sure that everyone is on board. But one thing I want to say about Paul's point about solidarity, yes, it is a term that we are currently using quite a lot, and even ourselves within the team, I think we've been thinking about the summit and even incorporating solidarity within it, because in many ways that's how we've seen the sector within Wales for quite a long time. But is it actually what it says on what we think it is, or what it says? Is relationship between the organizations in Wales, so to speak, and the partners, is it based on solidarity, or is it the same old development that other organizations are doing? I think if we're using those, words such as solidarity, obviously it's a change, it's a shift from international development, and that has to reflect across not just the HCA and Bond, but all the organizations and partners who are part of HCA. And I think, yeah, if you use the word solidarity, it is about connection. It's not about a one-way stream, say, of development again, if I'm using that phrase, coming from the north going to the south. But solidarity, obviously, we're trying to say there's commonality in what we stand for, and we come together as human beings, as so to speak, to address something and to share learning and to share experiences. There's mutuality within it, and so it's making sure, obviously, when we also do talk about solidarity, the partners understand exactly what solidarity means. For example, in Swahili, I don't know, Amina, correct me if I'm wrong, if you use the word solidarity, it could mean ujamaa, and ujamaa has its own connotation to some extent, which is positive and negative. So we have to think about those things.
Thanks, Vid. And I know we've had those discussions in our team as well about kind of solidarity, and actually, are they quite left-wing politics, like finishing meetings saying like in solidarity and things like that? And are we doing the opposite and going in the other direction with our language and being kind of mindful of that? I'm going to just, whilst we're talking about development, and Susie made a comment in the box as well about social justice and shared challenges that we work on together. So I'm just going to maybe bring Amina in on that in a second, and then I'm going to take a poll, and we're going to have a quick comfort break, because although Zoom is easy because we're not moving around, it's also quite exhausting to be on the screen. So we're going to have a break in a couple of minutes. But I was going to mention kind of about the UN SDGs, or the UN sustainability goals as well, which were meant to be a kind of a movement towards shared problems where we look for global solutions, not north and south, but actually they're challenges we all need to kind of face together. But in calling them kind of development goals again, we've almost moved it back into a north-south power dynamic again, potentially. I wonder, Amina, if you've obviously worked on sustainable development goals, I imagine through particularly the work you've done in terms of gender and and other areas like that, if there's any observations that you've made about the language of the SDGs, or if there has been a switch from the Millennial Development Goals, as I think they were, to sustainable development, and if you've got any observations on that, I'd be interested.
I'm trying to reflect real quickly and not be as biased as I can, but I don't know. On my side, I still feel we have quite a long way to go in terms of, especially with the SDG goals that we're particularly that are addressing women's rights, because then it's there's still conflicting in terms of like contextualizing that. There is conflicting scenarios between countries, and if I should speak for my country itself, it's a challenge on how we contextualize them. So yes, we have a vision to get to 2030 together and leave no one behind, but still there's a lot of work to be done on the ground to ensure that that's really actually a reality, if I should say so.
Thank you, Amina.
You're on mute, Claire.
Yeah, mute. I am on mute. And do you know what? I just muted myself before I began speaking in a weird kind of bored of my own voice. So it's time for a break, clearly. So I'm just going to take a moment because we would like a 5-minute break away from the screen. And my colleague Kath is just going to run another poll. Then we're just going to take a couple of minutes away from the screen, and then we're going to reconvene to go into breakout rooms. But if Kath, you could just run the poll.
It should be up there now. We just have one question, which is asking us to asking people to vote on what they think are going to be the next steps. So the question is, what are your next steps? And there's multiple choice. And I'm sorry, there is, if your answer doesn't quite fit in with what is there, but please click on the nearest kind of answer. There is going to be an opportunity for more detailed feedback and conversation later. But this is just to get a snapshot of how we're feeling at the end of the first half of the session. So we're going to have a short break, have a screen break and a comfort break. And then when we come back, we'll have the remaining kind of 35 minutes to have a discussion, both in breakout rooms and then when we come together. I'm just going to give 2 more minutes, 2 more seconds for the last couple of votes to come in. Okay, I think that's it. Yeah, so I'm going to end the poll and I'm sharing the results. Hopefully you can all see the results now. We have got 58% of the people who are in the room today have said that the next steps are to continue to talk with your partners, communities and fellow staff, volunteers and trustees to review the language that we use. So I'm going to stop sharing the results. Thank you very much for taking part in that. And over to you, Claire.